Actually, yeah, these days I usually come with a health warning rather than with a recommendation. Thanks. Well, it's good to be here. And the thing about Susie is that she knows whatever she asks me to talk about, I'll talk about it, even if I don't know anything about it. So apologies up front if this isn't exactly what you wanted. But all I can ever do is tell you what I know. And sometimes that's useful. So it seemed to me, when I was preparing for this talk, that there are three elements we need to think about in relation to drug or substance use and forensic psychiatry. There's substance use as a criminal act in itself, there's substance use as a cofactor in crime, and there's substance use as a treatment for crime. And the last one may be a little bit something you haven't thought about much, and there is not much research in it, but I think it's a very interesting angle, which we'll get to at the end. So those are the three things I'm going to cover. It's also really rather nice to be given a voice in this arena amongst colleagues and people in psychiatric field. Some of you may remember I used to advise the government on drugs until I was sacked. That is the cartoon of my being sacked in 2009. The reason I was sacked is because I was reading from the Book of Cannabis, which is a forbidden book in this country. The scales of justice at the bottom left-hand side show you the realities of the debate, which was I was arguing that alcohol and tobacco were actually much more harmful than cannabis or those other substances which are on the other side of the scales, new psychoactive substances, in the UK today. So I show you that just to remind you that this is a risky area to be talking in, and I'm particularly looking at the BBC correspondent here, making sure that you're responsible in what you say. But what the main reason for showing you this image, and I mean, can any of you actually see it through me? Yeah, and we have a slight, well, anyway, you can all move over to that side, I suppose, because, but anyway, look to the top left-hand corner, because the most interesting aspect of that particular week's news was Andre Agassi's crystal meth confession. Now, Agassi was a very good tennis player, as you know. Yeah, he was an American who won Wimbledon, and as Wimbledon champion, he was subjected, as tennis players are, to urine testing. And it turned out that he tested positive once for crystal meth, methamphetamine. And for reasons which aren't exactly scientific, the Lawn Tennis Association, along with most sporting organizations in the world, say that if you test positive for a Schedule I or Class A drug like crystal meth, you will have an automatic 2-year ban, and you could be banned for life. And some of you remember Adrian Tutu, the Chelsea footballer, was banned for life from playing football because he tested positive for cocaine. And in Agassi's case, that was a serious challenge to the authorities, because no major international sporting group wants to lose its number one star performer to an arbitrary drug test. And of course, we've seen the most remarkable example of that with Lance Armstrong, where the International Cycling Federation managed to ignore 7 years of exploitation or breaking of the rules in order to make sure that their leading cyclist was still the leading cyclist. Anyway, the lawn tennis authorities decided that they had to do something about this, but they didn't want to pursue their standard procedures, which was do a second test and then ban him. So they decided to do what I thought was a very English thing. They decided to ask him to tell the truth. Andre, did you actually take crystal meth? And he said, no, I didn't. Your tests must be rubbish, just like your tennis players. That was to the Wimbledon authorities. And they said, okay, whew, that's good. We'll trust you. Go away and never pee into a bottle again. And he didn't. And he never tested positive again. We don't know if he ever was tested again. But then interestingly, when his biography is coming out, he decides to come clean. He decides to tell the truth. Yes, I did take crystal meth. Unlike Stephen Fry, he didn't do it in Buckingham Palace, but he did it, and he got away with it. And that's, I think, a really important message. Because if you are very, very important, you can get away with breaking the rules. In fact, I suspect if he was caught with crystal meth in his pocket, he would have got away with it. But if you're not very important, you are very unlikely to get away with it. So that kind of emphasizes a sort of class distinction in the way we apply the drug laws in this country, which will become more apparent as I go through my talk. However, the good news is that President Obama now agrees with me that alcohol is more harmful than cannabis. And that is probably the first time an American president since Thomas Jefferson has actually told the truth about anything. But it's really important that Obama has told the truth about cannabis. And it's important because Americans can now have access to medical cannabis without fear of prosecution from the Drug Enforcement Agency. But it's even more important for the rest of the world because it means that the USA no longer dictates world drug policy. If it can't keep its own states in order, it cannot possibly expect us to do what it tells us and has been telling us for the last 50 years. So that is truly one of the landmark changes in the attitude of the world to drugs. This is truly a watershed moment. And it raises all sorts of interesting problems. So for instance, if you let one of your inmates from here out on leave and they go to Amsterdam and legally smoke cannabis and come back and are tested positive for cannabis in their urine, have they broken the law or not? I don't know. Does anyone here know? No one knows, of course, because we haven't tested it at that point. But the reality is if they haven't broken the law in the Netherlands where they consume the drug, they haven't broken the law, I think. So let's have a few moments thinking about what is a drug. And perhaps more importantly, who should say what a drug is? Should it be me? Should it be Obama? Should it be politicians? Should it be scientists? So this is my favorite definition of what a drug is. A drug is something a politician once used but now regrets. And Jackie Smith, when she was made Home Secretary, was asked the standard question, did you ever take drugs? And instead of telling the truth, which was, yes, I drink Chardonnay every night, but only half a bottle, she said, I used to smoke cannabis, but I didn't enjoy. And there's a very important message here, which we need to get out to all of our patients and clients and our children, which is that not enjoying is not a defense in law. And you'd hope the Home Secretary knew that. And you ask yourself, why did she smoke cannabis? And the answer is, we don't know, she hasn't told us. But my view is that she did it because that's what you had to do to get into the Labour Party in Oxford when she was a student there. And David Cameron said, I did things when young I shouldn't have, we all did. Now that we is called the Eton we, otherwise known as the Tory front bench. And the great thing about David and his conservative cronies is that they are very conservative in the drugs they use. They only use drugs that begin with the same letter as the Conservative Party. Cannabis, cocaine, well, you can think of the others. Of course, some politicians take a slightly different view. I'd be interested to know whether Boris Johnson has ever been urine tested, but it would have been interesting if he had been. As he said, it's an outrageous slur, of course I've taken drugs. And that is something that some people allege he still does. And of course, there's this famous statement from George Bush, the leader of the free world, the man who drove us into this war, which is destroying the Middle East. I wouldn't answer the marijuana question. You know why? Because I don't want some little kid doing what I tried. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that if I said that, I had used marijuana, I could now be banned from going to the USA. You remember Nigella Lawson was taken off a plane as she was about to fly to Los Angeles because the US authorities thought she was a bad influence and they didn't want her in America because she admitted to taking cocaine some years ago. I think Americans should apply that to their presidents who've used cannabis and they should keep him out. He could become stateless like many people who come into the sort of limbo land of drug use and travel. And I want to say one last point about our politicians, because it's hugely important in the way we are currently constructing a dialogue about addiction in this country. The current government is trying to define addiction out of medicine. It sees the cost of addiction, which is maybe about 10% of the total medical budget, as an easy target. And they would like addiction to disappear. They would like there to be no treatments other than self-will and abstinence. And the reason they can pursue this completely misguided and ignorant policy is that the current government were heavy drug users. Many of them were heavy drug users as students. There they are. This is the Bullingdon Club. This image, which they now try to suppress, of Boris Johnson, David Cameron. Osborne's not in that picture, but he was one of them. They used to engage in considerable amounts of drug taking in order to facilitate a vast consumption of alcohol. And the two together led to a considerable amount of violence, for which they never got prosecuted because they always had enough money to pay off the police and the people whose properties they destroyed. And then when they went into politics, they stopped using. And their view is that anyone can stop using if they can stop using. They fail to understand that they come from a rather privileged background. Those uniforms that they're wearing there cost of the order of £5,000. So it's not trivial to become a member of that club. And the amount of drugs they use must have easily matched that in the course of their lifetime. So that is the privileged view of what drug addiction is. Of course, the reality is very different. And it's absolutely critical that people from that background who have used drugs and stopped do not assume that everyone can do that. And the other thing we need to challenge is this a massive disinformation that is perpetuated by the drinks industry. So this is an advert: say no to drugs, that way you'll have more time to drink. Now, you laugh, and it is funny, but this is the pervasive attitude that most people in Britain have to alcohol. It's not a drug. And when you say to people, well, of course it's a drug, you drink because it changes the way you feel, it must be a drug. And you might get hungover, and you might even get liver cirrhosis. How can you think it's not a drug? And the average person says, well, if it was a drug, it would be illegal. And that circularity of arguments is one that the drinks industry promotes with an enormous expertise, because they have and are winning the argument that alcohol isn't a drug, it's actually a lifestyle choice or a foodstuff, or even just something pleasant to drink. And I just hope the drinks industry doesn't latch on to this. This is the doctor saying, I needed vodka to stop shaking so I could perform my job. And here's an interesting example of self-medication with alcohol. So this is a woman, an anaesthetist, who is being prosecuted for killing someone through her incompetence. And she was arguing, her defense was, I had to drink, because if I didn't drink, I shook too much. And the interesting question, of course, is did she have benign essential tremor, which of course is remediable by alcohol, or did she have alcoholism and withdrawal, and was she treating her withdrawal? And at some point, that judge will decide. I imagine she probably had at least the latter and possibly the former. And the way in which drugs lead to crime is complicated. This is a rather good diagram from Richard Hammersley, showing the separate factors, such as social exclusion, such as drug exposure, such as life problems, leading to stress, and the use of drugs to deal with stress, and then the drugs themselves, of course, becoming, in their own way, a stress, and maybe the greatest stressor of all if you become addicted to drugs like heroin or crack. And homicide is a crime we'd like to minimize. Homicide in the world is strongly linked to drug intake. In South America, homicide is, of course, the massive problem associated with cocaine, the cocaine trade. And also, now we see huge problems in West Africa as the South American gangs transport cocaine to Europe through West Africa rather than through the Caribbean. And of course, other areas of the world where there's massive homicide, such as Russia and South Africa, a lot of it is driven by excessive alcohol consumption. So let's just have a few words about drugs. And drugs are pharmaceuticals. drugs can be recreational, and some drugs, like alcohol, are still seen as foodstuffs or commodities. The way we control drugs in this country is complicated, unnecessarily so in my mind. But some drugs are controlled as medicines under the Medicines Act. Some drugs are controlled as recreational drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act in the Home Office. Drugs like alcohol and tobacco are taxed as a way of raising revenue and controlling use. Solvents have limited, access is limited to people over the age of 18. And then drugs like cat and coffee were unregulated until recently. Cat has now been made illegal, largely because of American pressure to do it. But coffee is still unregulated and available to anyone. And one of the problems is that the majority of drugs which are used recreationally are also medicines. So we have a very difficult situation here where there is conflict between medical use and recreational use. And many people run the risk of being prosecuted for self-medication with medicines where they don't have a prescription. So if we think about illegal drugs, we can think about very different sorts of drugs. And this is important because in clinical practice, we may see people suffering the effects of depressants, such as alcohol and opiates and benzos, or suffering the effects of stimulants like cocaine, crack, amphetamine, methamphetamine, MDMA, ecstasy, or BZP. We have psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, sometimes come into are responsible for psychiatric assessments. And also salvinorin, which is another psychedelic, but it's legal at present. And then we have cannabis and the cannabinoids, which are a particular issue in prisons, and at present I'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. The way drugs are controlled in this country is under the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, an act which is so out of date, it's embarrassing, hasn't changed in 50 years. And basically, drugs are classified into class A, B, or C according to their considered harm, and the class determines the penalties. So you can get 7 years for possessing a class A drug, like magic mushrooms or heroin. You can get life for supplying it. And you can get 14 years for supplying a class B drug, or 14 years for supplying a class C drug. And the reason they're the same is when cannabis was downgraded from B to C in 2004, the government decided to upgrade the penalties just to show that it didn't really believe what it was doing. Now, over the years, I've spent a lot of time working on how we assess the harms of drugs. And this is a structure of harm assessment, the most sophisticated I think there's ever been, which we put together with the Home Office in the 2000s. And it breaks drugs harms down into 16 different criteria or parameters of harm. 9 relate to the user and 7 relate to society. And using that set of 16 harms, we compared 20 drugs and came up with this analysis here, which was published in The Lancet in 2010. And this shows the overall estimate of harms in the UK for 20 drugs. The one on the left, the top one on the left, is alcohol, and the bottom one on the right is magic mushrooms. The blue bars reflect the extent of harm, the relative extent of harm of each drug to the user, and the red bars, the extent of harm to society. And alcohol is the most harmful drug because the red bar for alcohol is so enormous, and that's because alcohol is so damaging to society. 40% of road traffic accidents, about 70% of domestic violence, a similar amount of child sexual abuse and other abuse, etc. The most harmful drug to the user is crack cocaine, followed by heroin, followed by crystal meth, with alcohol about 4th. But overall, in the UK, alcohol is the most harmful drug, and that's where we believe the effort should be put to reduce harms. That was what I was saying when I was sacked. In terms of today's symposium, we know that between 30 and 50% of violent crimes are alcohol associated. And here you have a whole series of data sets that give you the comparative contribution of alcohol in those different forms of violence. Remarkably, frighteningly, we now know that alcohol is the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 16 and 44. And in the next decade, it'll be the leading cause of death of women in that age as well, because women are now drinking even more than men. This is a remarkable discovery, and it's one that should be very well known to everyone. This is the justification for doing something about alcohol, because it's particularly damaging to young people. And the other fact is that when you look at the analysis of the harms of different drugs and compare them with the Misuse of Drugs Act, which was supposed to be based on the evidence of harm, there is no correlation. A correlation of 0.04 is no correlation. And that tells us the law is unjust, because people are prosecuted irrationally. They're prosecuted for possessing drugs which are less harmful than alcohol. And that actually encourages the use of alcohol. And also, and there's another topic I haven't got time to talk about today, but the drug laws have enormously detrimental effect on research. Only 4 hospitals in this country have a license to hold cannabis for research. Every hospital in this country can hold heroin. So even if cannabis was legal tomorrow, no one would be able to use it, because unless the licensing situation was changed, no hospitals, or only 4 hospitals, can hold it. And cannabis has been a source of considerable discussion and debate over the last decade. There's Alan Johnson, the man who sacked me, smoking a spliff of which I'm part. And I just want to emphasize that cannabis is not a new drug. Cannabis is probably the oldest medicine in the world. It's been detected in Egyptian tombs going back 4,000 years. And it was very popular in Victorian times. Queen Victoria used cannabis for period pains and for the pains of childbirth. And it was a medicine until 1971. And then 2 GPs in Ladbroke Grove in London started prescribing tincture of cannabis and telling people to drop it onto their onto tobacco, dry it out and smoke it. And the government at that time decided it was politically expedient to ban the drug, because that was what the Americans wanted us to do, rather than just ban the doctors. So since then, we've not had access to medicinal cannabis. And we estimate now that at least 30,000 people a day break the law using cannabis medicinally. Interestingly, making it illegal under the 1971 Act and banning it as a medicine had no impact whatsoever on use. The use of cannabis increased 20 times in the next 40 years. So that, in fact, the majority of people, certainly the majority of students, have tried it. Now, you might imagine if there was some harm from cannabis, you'd see that if there was a 20-fold increase in the number of users. But it's proved rather difficult to demonstrate any harms, which is a bit of a challenge to the government as to why they keep it illegal. But they do keep it illegal, and this is what they do today. This is an example of how we police people using medicinal cannabis today. This is one of many examples I get on a regular basis of people who are prosecuted by the police for using cannabis medicinally. So this is a woman in a wheelchair. 3 times the police have smashed her door down in dawn raids. You might say, well, why do they do that when she's in a wheelchair and she can't jump out the window to run away? And the answer is because they get overtime, and they like doing it. And the war on drugs empowers people to be violent to people in wheelchairs if they smoke cannabis. And she had 3 convictions. The next conviction would mean she must go to prison. So her life is in the hands of the police at any point they can, because she has to keep using, because it's the only thing that gives her relief. And I have to say, I don't think Queen Victoria would be amused by that kind of behavior at all. It's weird. We've gone backwards in 100 years in terms of this medicine. And the reason we've done it is because we actually use drugs for political reasons, the drug laws for political reasons, rather than look at them as health issues. And the government knows this is a problem, but cannabis is a very, very easy way of trying to gain votes. So here are the justifications for keeping cannabis illegal are skunk, driving risk, and schizophrenia risk. And I just want to go through each of those in turn. Why do we have skunk? We have skunk because we were quite successful in reducing the importation of hash from Morocco. Cannabis is bulky, it's smelly, and we were able to stop it, a lot of it. So what happened? Vietnamese gangs started growing high-strength THC in this country. We've seen the most ridiculous claims. The president of the Royal College of General Practitioners said that skunk was 100 times more potent than hash. A leading scientist, supposedly, in the House of Lords, said that one spliff kills 1 million cells in the hippocampus. And we've had other scientists say it's a leading cause of schizophrenia. All of those are wrong. And then we had the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, saying skunk is lethal, as he tried to use an anti-cannabis campaign in the last election. The reality is that skunk contains about 15% THC, whereas hash contains about 5%. So skunk is to hash as wine is to beer. Yes, if you drink beer by the pint, it's more damaging. But if you drink wine to a level of intoxication, it's no more harmful than beer. The other problem with skunk is that it has no cannabidiol, and cannabidiol may be protective against the effects of THC. So we've created a more, potentially more intoxicating, possibly more addictive substance simply by prohibiting a less damaging form. Although most users don't smoke excessive amounts of skunk, and therefore, because they titrate to the same level of intoxication they get with hash. What about driving? Well, the government's own report, very good report, came out last year, which they're largely trying to ignore now, showed that cannabis was associated with a twofold increase in road traffic accidents. Alcohol use is associated with an 8 times increase in road traffic accidents, and two together are additive. And in fact, we've seen from the American experiment of medical cannabis that as more people use cannabis, there's less deaths on the road from alcohol, and there are very few deaths on the road from cannabis. So cannabis use seems to protect people against dying from alcohol on the roads. And what about schizophrenia? Now, you might imagine a 20-fold increase in cannabis users over 40 years would manifest itself in an increase in schizophrenia. So here's the data that we presented to the government when we said it doesn't. This is the data from the MRC GP network, and it looks at the prevalence and the incidence of psychosis and of schizophrenia over the time when there would have been an impact of cannabis use on schizophrenia. You don't need statistics to tell you there's no impact. And that is true in every Western country where we've seen this massive increase in cannabis use. There is no population increase in schizophrenia caused by the massive increase in cannabis use. But there's only one study that is ever been powered to possibly show this association, and that's the Swedish conscript study. And if you take that as face value, which is generous, but we will, you've got to stop 5,000 young men and 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis to stop one case of schizophrenia. Now, that is not in any sense a tractable public health problem. And it's certainly not one you could deal with by criminalization of users. However, in the last decade, due to the efforts of Home Secretaries like Smith, we have criminalized 1 million young people, largely men, for possessing cannabis. It costs £500 million a year to give these people criminal records. And we create an underclass of people who cannot get employment because they have criminal records. And we've done this in the pretense that we're going to stop them becoming psychotic. It is truly one of the greatest deceits in the history of medicine. And of course, unjust policing on an unjust cause leads to a lot of public turmoil. It's also a racist policy because there's a massive overrepresentation of black and Asian men. I mean, this is truly, it's a disgrace to live in a country which has done that and justified it on the basis of the harms of cannabis. And it's also led to this problem, this massive problem of the rise of spice in prisons. I don't know if you have spice here. Do you have spice here? Do you get spice into Broadmoor? You don't know. You can't test for it. We know that a lot of prisoners are using these synthetic cannabinoids to get high because they cannot be tested for. They're so potent, you don't pick them up in the urine, and also there are thousands of them, so no one knows what to test for. So we've now created this monster of super potent cannabis agonists, which are prevalent in prisons, potentially much more psychotoxic than cannabis. And it's all been done to try to stop people using cannabis, because these are legal. And we don't even know how to make them illegal now, because we don't even know how to measure them. So we've created another monster as a result of trying to prohibit the use of a less harmful drug. And this is absolutely typical for the history of mankind. If you prohibit relatively mild drugs, people will move into more dangerous drugs. Prohibiting opium led to heroin. When we prohibited alcohol in America, people started drinking methanol, and so on. So that was the core of my talk. I just want to finish with this controversial topic of, can we use illegal drugs to reduce crime? Can we actually improve society by allowing more sensible access? So obviously, if we decriminalize drug use like they did in Portugal, at a stroke, we would reduce hundreds of thousands of people getting extra criminal records each year. And there are other things we could do. Well, we know about opiate substitution treatment, methadone and buprenorphine, which the government is trying to get rid of. The government wanted us, as addiction doctors, to limit the use of methadone to 6 weeks. The ACMD, I'll give them credit, stood up to them, refused to accept that, and wrote a report which was published last week to 0. How many of you knew that the ACMD published a report on methadone treatment last week? How many of you work in addiction? Any of you work in addiction? Oh, so you're all here to learn this morning. Huh? Yeah. None of you, there was no publicity to this report at all because it contradicted what the government wanted it to say. But the government would like methadone to disappear because they think it's feeding people's pleasures. And those of you who worked in addiction will know that very few people enjoy taking methadone or even buprenorphine. So opiate substitution therapies massively reduce crime. That is why they were brought in, to reduce crime in the first place, and subsequently they were shown to reduce AIDS. Sodium oxybate. Any of you work with alcoholics? Well, of course you do, because if you work in prisons or in these, a third of your patients are alcoholic, but you maybe don't bother to treat them. But sodium oxybate is a drug which is licensed even in this country for the treatment of alcoholism, popular in Italy and Austria, rarely used in this country, but an alternative to alcohol, safer alcohol. And then stimulants for stimulant abuse and stimulants for ADHD. Now, Phil Asherson's going to talk about stimulants for ADHD, so I won't talk much on those, but I just want to talk about one or two other interesting aspects of drugs that you might not know about. So the first thing is in terms of immediacy of harm, injected opioids are extraordinarily dangerous. And I have continual battles with organizations that are normally very sensible, like Transform, who think that the problems of heroin come from dirty needles. The problems from heroin come from dirty needles, but they also come from the fact that heroin kills you because it stops you breathing. And these are data we produced a few years ago now, showing that heroin is so much more likely to kill you than any other drug because it's used intravenously. So it is an extremely dangerous drug, and anything we can do to stop people injecting opiates is well worth doing. We know that ADHD is a common cause of crime. We know that ADHD treatments work. And we know here, this is a graph from a recent European white paper on ADHD, a very, very good paper. If you want to read it, it's down here. You can see making the invisible visible, showing that treatment of ADHD has a massive improvement. ADHD patients should only drive if they're on stimulants or other treatments. In some countries, that's a legal requirement. In this country, it's a little bit of a grey area. But I'd much rather my lorry driver with ADHD was on a treatment than not, because he's much more likely to stick to his lane. And then you can see across here that there's, in some areas, there's less effect. But in every area of life, treatment produces benefit. And we should be rolling out treatment, particularly, as Philip will explain, in the forensic system, because so many people there have ADHD. And this is one of the most remarkable studies I've ever seen. This study looks at criminality in people with ADHD in those who are treated and those who are not treated. And it shows the red bars are women and the blue bars are men. And these are data which only Sweden and Denmark could generate. This is Swedish data because they have a proper register of people of everyone's illness and everyone's criminal records. And they were able to show that men and women who were on treatment committed less crimes than those who had ADHD and were not on treatment. So this is a population study that shows you can reduce criminality by proper medical treatment. Rather interesting. In fact, similar data, some of you may know that, recently published just a few months ago, showing exactly the same for schizophrenia. If you treat schizophrenia properly, there's much less violence. So we know that drug treatment reduces crime, and treatment of ADHD reduces. So this is enormously important data. We can never generate this data in Britain because we don't have the databases, but it's almost certainly going to be relevant here too. And then what about this question, this very challenging question, but people say, well, you're giving people stimulants, they're going to become addicts. And the truth is that there is very little evidence that stimulant treatment of ADHD leads to stimulant use. Here's a study showing that it actually decreases stimulant use because people don't need to self-medicate. And here is a very good meta-analysis in JAMA a couple of years ago looking at treatment of ADHD with stimulants, looking at outcomes in terms of alcohol abuse, no effect, cocaine abuse, no effect, cannabis use, no effect, and nicotine use, no effect. And but the interesting thing, the only interesting thing in this whole study, which shows a complete lack of effect, is this observation here of the one study that claimed a very significant effect to increase cannabis use as an artifact. And it's got severe publication bias. So when you do things right, we can show that stimulant treatment of ADHD doesn't lead to poorer outcomes in terms of drug misuse. And we can use stimulants to treat drug misuse. This is a beautiful study from the Karolinska. It's a thesis I examined last year, showing that if you treat people who abuse amphetamines with a safer and less abusable stimulant like methylphenidate, you can keep them in treatment for longer. They're less likely to relapse. And you also, interestingly, improve their ADHD as well. And the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Basically, if people are doing better because they're in treatment, then they've got less reason to use drugs. They've got other reinforcers, other rewards in their life. And also, it might well be the case that if you're on a stimulant for ADHD, cocaine is less effective because it doesn't get into the brain as fast or produces bigger change. And we've seen a model of that with the drug Zyban bupropion for smoking cessation, which probably works in that way. And this is my last slide. I want to finish now by just sharing with you this something. I don't suppose any of you saw this last week in Nature. But this is an article, little perspective piece I put together, which addresses the really challenging question that is almost no research being done now in terms of finding new drugs for psychiatric disorders. Almost every company in the world has poured out of this field because it's too difficult. And that means we're facing, as psychiatrists, a serious problem, a kind of black hole of research absence for the next 10, 20 years. So how can we redress this imbalance? And I think we should do something rather creative. We should look to see whether other drugs that are being used might have an impact on psychiatric symptoms. And we can do that in two ways. We can do that through looking at whether drugs that are used for other indications. And in this article here, I quote a fascinating audit from Columbia University, published, well, not even published yet, but reported a few months ago at the APA, showing that people with schizophrenia on long-term warfarin treatment seem to do better than people who weren't on warfarin treatment. Now, you'd never, anyone would imagine that warfarin could be a treatment for schizophrenia, but it might be. So looking at unexpected beneficial effects of drugs like warfarin, ketamine is another example for depression, could lead to new insights. But then there's another more provocative and challenging approach, which is to tap into this massive use of recreational drugs worldwide. Probably 1 million people a day take a new substance. It's never been studied properly in humans. We should work out ways of gathering positive information from them. Some of them may have discovered a new treatment for depression accidentally, but unless we find ways of tapping into that data set, we will never know. So this article is an interesting thought piece around how we can actually turn the whole table, rather than see drugs as a problem, and it's something which we should try to stop. We should see drugs as an opportunity to lead to perhaps a new generation of psychiatric interventions. Thank you.